Welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Dick Black, and I'm joined today by our friend Jim Jatras. Jim is a tremendous foreign policy expert who was with the United States Senate for quite a number of years, and then represented the Republicans in the Senate, and has a tremendous background. His family also was deeply involved in the politics of the Balkans, of Serbia in particular, and Russia also. His father was an Air Force pilot, a great conservative patriot, and his mother, Stella Jatras, was a tremendous hero of Serbia, and in fact, she was given a medal posthumously for her heroic representation of the Christian people of Serbia at a time when the Islamic terrorists out of Albania were slaughtering Christians in Kosovo. And of course, Bill Clinton, in the War of Monica's Dress, decided on the eve of his impeachment to distract the world by attacking Serbia in a totally unprovoked attack, which drove the Christians out. And for the first time, I guess, since the earliest 1900s, the Muslims were able to expand their foothold in Europe. So Stella was a tremendous hero in resisting that. And so anyway, Jim, welcome to Focus on the News. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure and an honor as always.
We're going to start off today, and we're going to talk a little bit about some comments that Larry Summers made. Larry Summers was the former U.S. Treasurer. He was the Secretary of Treasury, and a Democrat moderate, I would say. And he has warned that the United States is losing its global influence as other powers form trading blocs. Jim, what do you think about this, and why is this all happening?
It's always a bit of a shock when an establishment figure commits a faux pas by letting the truth slip out here and there. You don't really expect that to happen. I can't help but put it in the context of what Grandma Janet Yellen said the other day, that the dollar will still maintain its position as the lead currency in the world because of the power of the American financial system. That's why the greenback will stay on top. And she seems to not understand, or doesn't want people to understand, that what supports the dollar or any other currency is not a financial system, a bunch of wizards on Wall Street trading, shopping, and rearranging the same debt over and over again. It's the productive economy. And of course, unfortunately for us in America, the world's most productive economy is not us anymore. It's China, which is why the redback, as some people are already calling the yuan, is starting to replace the greenback in international affairs. I don't fault the Chinese for that. I fault our leaders for that, for running a tax and trade policy and an imperial policy that is almost seems designed to destroy the productive capacity of this country, and for which Americans will now start really paying. And I think that's what Mr. Summers is pointing to.
Yeah, we in this country seem deliberately focused on creating a massive non-working population where people are given such abundant income through welfare and just paying for everything in the world. Now We're talking about reparations, that we will pay people if they have dark skin. We'll transfer money from people who have light skin. And we will literally make multi-millionaires out of people who have never lifted a finger to support themselves in their entire lives, and suddenly they'll become among the richest people in the country. Just looking at China, it's my impression, and I certainly am open to any criticism, but I think China is much more capitalistic than we are. They have the name, it's the communist, it's a communist government, and it is certainly an autocratic government, but Chinese like to make a buck. They want money. They want to raise their standards of living, and they don't have the massively regulated system where if you go into business in China, I don't think you're going to be faced with hundreds of thousands of pages of regulations and so forth. I'm sure there are things there, and probably some of them are not good, but they seem to be more on a capitalist free market track than we are. I could be wrong. Correct me if I am.
No, I think you're right, Senator, and I think the showpiece of that is what the Chinese are doing to integrate the trade and travel and communications route through Eurasia in a way that, first off, makes China more secure, so they're not dependent on sea lanes, which can be interdicted by the U.S. Navy. So that's good geopolitics for the Chinese as well. I think Pat Buchanan said that the Chinese are acting like 19th century Americans, so that they're basically concentrating on building their country, whereas our leaders are concentrating on trying to undermine any efforts to build up a global economy, not globalism, but good trade relations between sovereign countries who respect each other's sovereignty in a way that unfortunately our leaders do not, as they go around trying to impose rainbow tyranny on the rest of the planet, which doesn't benefit the American people at all. And with regard to what I was saying earlier about the dollar, when the day is coming to an end, when Americans can sort of benefit from that bubble of buying cheap stuff at Walmart and Target for a lot less than it's really worth, at the same time as our own country's productive capacity is lessening. What is the reaction of our leaders? Well, let's try to undermine what they're doing. Now you have the Chinese brokering peace between the Saudis and the Iranians. We've got a potential of peace breaking out between the Saudis and the Yemenis, between the Syrians and the Saudis, between the Turks and the Syrians. The Chinese are even talking about trying to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians together in a way that America has failed to do. And what is the U.S. reaction? Let's try to sabotage it. Let's try to make sure they fail at doing it. Let's be the spoiler. How does that benefit the American people? It doesn't at all. You'd think we would be looking at ways of building similar infrastructure. Where are our high-speed rail systems? Where's the integration of communications and transportation through the Western Hemisphere in the way that the Chinese are building in Eurasia? There doesn't seem to be any productive or constructive vision on the part of our leaders, frankly, whether Republicans or Democrats.
Jim, it's always seemed to me that, America faces enormous internal problems of crime. Our election system has broken down. The cartels have a massive infrastructure within the United States where they're controlling people who owe them money for paying their passage across the border into the U.S. They're able to contact all of these people by cell phones, which the cartels control the numbers to the cell phones, and they can call up and say, we expect you to vote, and we expect you to vote for this person. And so they control our voting system. We have such massive problems in this country. And I understand the frustration of politicians who are faced with different challenges, difficult challenges. But it's so easy when somebody says, what are you going to do about this? You say, well, the Chinese are floating a balloon over the United States and the world is going to end, because there's some stupid balloon floating up in the air. And they're able to divert the attention of the American people to things that are totally meaningless, just absolute trivial pursuit. And I think to some extent it's very popular with politicians because everybody agrees. Yeah, we ought to kill Russians, kill Chinese, kill Iranians, kill Venezuelans, kill Cuba, kill everybody. It's easy to say, go after somebody on the other side of the planet and hold them accountable for our own internal failures. It's just an easy thing to do. But you mentioned what's happening in the Middle East. It seems to me that this is really a tectonic shift. This is not some flash in the pan, but if you go back to particularly the days of George Bush, when decisions were made that we were going to create massive war and disruption throughout the Middle East, and somehow this would redound to our advantage and perhaps to Israel's advantage. What do you think about what is happening in the Middle East these days?
Well, in addition to those efforts to bring peace to some of these various conflicts, as you mentioned with regard to Israel, that is a big focus of American policy. And in recent years, the linchpin of that was a working arrangement between the Saudis and the Israelis aimed at Iran. That's all coming down now. And the question now is, what would the Israelis do? Because I don't think it's revealing any state secrets to say that the Israelis have an awful lot of influence over American policy. We see, by the way, these big demonstrations against Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, which apparently are being abetted by the Biden administration in one of these classic regime change operations. Whatever you think of Netanyahu, he's not stupid. And he has a good personal relationship with President Putin. He gets along well with the Chinese. And it's, to tell the truth, if anybody can help broker a settlement in Israel and with Israel and the Palestinians, I think the Chinese have a shot at it. At some point, the Israelis are, if they have any sense, and I think they do, because unlike us, they actually have a good sense of their own national interest. They will look at the way the wind is blowing in the Middle East and say, you know what, we better find some way to get onto the Eurasian train as well. And I think there may be a possibility to do that. It's going to involve some hard decisions for them, but I think they're smart enough and self-interested enough to find a way to do that. I think unfortunately for a lot of Americans, when they think of Israel, they don't think of just, a country. They think of either some kind of, divinely inspired creation that has a mandate from heaven for us to rubber stamp anything the Israelis want, or you have some people say that it's some kind of, demon country that's destroying everything and persecuting everybody and must be destroyed. I don't look at it either way. I look at it as a country that has its interests. We should have a good relationship with it, but we shouldn't be rubber stamping its interest than we do any more than any other country's interests. We should learn how to look out for our own interests, which unfortunately we don't know how to do.
Yeah, I was reading in oil.com this morning. I have an interest in the oil markets, and it's quite fascinating that with all of the sanctions and so forth, the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE in particular, are beginning to import enormous amounts of refined Russian petroleum products, naphtha, diesel, all sorts of things in large amounts. Now, previously they didn't import any. They just, I guess I'm not sure if they did their own refining or not, but now the refined products are coming from Russia, and they in the Middle East, they've simply said, we're just not going to play this sanctions game, sanctioning Russia. We're not going to do it. But you look at OPEC Plus, which now includes Russia, has kind of evolved beyond just being an oil trading bloc, and it's now become a political bloc as well. Sort of an economic and political bloc. You have Syria. It looks like they're going to be readmitted to the Arab League. We forced them out of the Arab League in 2011 when we first instituted the war in Syria in an attempt to overthrow the government there. You've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and others, and they are, what was formerly just sort of a little local organization that coordinated some of their internal problems. They're now gaining power, prestige, and of all things, the BRICS. What do you think of the things that seem to be going on with the BRICS countries?
Well, of course, with the return to power of Mr. Lula in Brazil, I think we will see Brazil even more actively involved with the India and China and Russia and so forth. And by the way, even under Bolsonaro, they didn't really pull out of that, but it was more muted than it will now be under Lula. I think you're right that I think we're starting to see a dovetailing or a coming together of these various organizations like OPEC. Let's note that most of the other major oil producers are cutting their production because Washington has asked them to increase production to try to to hurt Russia, keep the prices low and so forth. That's not working. A lot of countries that are supposedly boycotting Russian energy are actually buying it through intermediaries. We even have a country as subservient to Washington as Japan buying Russian oil at above the so-called price cap. So, nothing seems to be going right for these people. I'd like to think that in a supposed democracy, you'd have an opposition party, namely the Republicans, who would find some way to put the American national interest first, and all they seem to be capable of doing is faulting the Democrats for not being even more militantly stupid when it comes to Ukraine and Russia and China. I'm sure you've seen this cartoon in various forms where you've got this sort of the blank-faced idiot wearing a pink hat on the Democratic side saying Russia, 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 and then you've got a similar face with a MAGA hat saying China, China, China. And as you were saying earlier, this is just a distraction. This is the way the people pulling the strings in the city not too far from where you and I both live to distract people from the real source of their problems, which not Moscow, it's not Beijing, it's not Tehran, it's right up the road here a piece.
Yeah, we have a question from one of our listeners. What do we think is going to happen with the Fed and the local grocery bills from the DeDolarization? Do we think the country is going to experience a Great Depression? And what about the price of gasoline? Well, that covers a lot of ground, but when you talk about de-dollarization, it's interesting. I ran across quite a fascinating video, and what it did, it had a pie chart that showed various reserve currencies on it. And typically there's not a reserve currency, there are multiple reserve currencies, and their importance shifts over time. And the particular video actually showed the expansion and contraction of these different types of currencies. Some of them would expand and then they'd gradually almost disappear. Others would come on the scene and fade and rise again. And I think, we're not going to see the US dollar just simply evaporate into nothing. What we're going to see, I suspect, is other currencies that will expand in importance. And, there is talk about the BRICS creating some sort of a gold supported currency. And if you go back to the US invasion of Libya in 2011, we went in there to capture their arsenal in order to provide Al-Qaeda the weapons to overthrow Syria. But there was another reason, and one of the reasons that the French were so deeply involved is that Colonel Gaddafi, the great African leader, I mean, that's the way he was viewed, and he had proposed that they create a gold-backed dinar, that it would be an African dinar. It wouldn't just be a Libyan dinar. But Libya had 214 tons of gold, 2,000 tons of silver, and vast quantities of rare earths. And this was going to be sort of the foundation. And I think that the Western powers panicked at the very notion that someone would have a gold-backed currency, and people would say, well, okay, I can have a greenback, which is a piece of paper, or I can have an African dinar, which is something I can exchange for gold if I choose to do so. That's a tremendous threat. And now you can see the possibility that the BRICS countries, which have vast sums of gold, may do something like that, which I think could be a truly a mortal threat to the greenback.
That's right. Of course, Nixon took us off the gold standard in the 1970s, and then since the 1970s, the real backing of the American dollar has been the petrodollar, the arrangement with the Saudis to denominate oil sales in dollars. That's pretty much going away now too. And so what really has been the backing of the American dollar is the perception of American global power militarily. That's going now too because of the war in Ukraine. I think you're right. The dollar is not going to disappear, but unfortunately, rather than trying to find some way to back up the dollar in a way that makes sense economically, I think we're going to see as our leadership doubling down to try to unveil this central bank digital currency and to phase out paper money so that they can actually control us entirely electronically, turn off your bank account with the push of a button, rather than trying to find some way where we can find our footing for the greenback with the red back, the gold back, the brown back, the broke back, whatever back is out there in the international market, because this is still a great country. This is a country with a lot of productive capacity. Unfortunately, our leaders just don't think that way. And that's the sad thing, Senator. I don't know how we get into power in this country, anybody with any common sense. I like a lot of what Trump says or what he tried to do. If he were to get reelected, which I have real doubts about given the lack of integrity in our voting system these days, would he do any better than he did first time around in actually controlling his own administration? Or will it just be a dismal replay of what happened before, where he had a bunch of, regular Republicans from the leftover from the Bush administration, just following down the same old path that got us here in the first place. And I really think that hard times are coming, Senator, and that I think something will arise from the ashes, some kind of America that is not just this woke nonsense or Republican Me Tooism, but we're not there yet. I think we've got a real rough patch ahead of us, and let's just hope something decent can come out of it.
Yeah. Listen, there's another topic I want to just touch on briefly, and we have an article based on an interview with Colonel Douglas McGregor, friend of mine. He tremendous strategic mind, and he said that Russia is winning the fight against Ukraine, and he does not believe that Kiev has the resources, either the personnel or the weaponry, to conduct a successful counteroffensive this spring. And they've said, okay, somewhere around April 30th, there's going to be some grand offensive where Ukraine is going to attack in all sorts of places, and they're going to drive Russia from out of the Russian-speaking areas in the Donbass and in the south and Crimea ultimately. Which Crimea, I don't know whether anybody still speaks Ukrainian in Crimea. It's almost 100% Russian speaking. But what do you think about the current status of the war?
Well, as a subject of the Russian Federation, as Moscow understands it, Crimea still has among its official languages, besides Russian, Ukrainian, and Tatar. So it's still spoken there to some extent, or at least officially. I think what we're likely to see is something similar to what happened with the Ukrainian offensive in the fall at Kharkov and in Kherson, where they expended a lot of their equipment and men in making some fairly limited advances that didn't make any strategic difference, but cost them very, very dearly. And if they do manage to mount an offensive, which is, I think, somewhat in question, even if it's wildly successful, which I don't expect it to be, but even if it is, even if they reach the Sea of Azov, which again won't really cut Crimea off from Russia because of the bridge and other ways, ports, the ways they can get there, this would be the last roll of their dice. They're going to use up any remaining equipment, and the Washington and Brussels have been scouring the world for tanks, for ammunition to give to the Ukrainians, and those will be destroyed in this offensive if it happens, and they won't have anything left after that. Now, my biggest fear is that there will be some push then for a ceasefire, suing for peace, some kind of a rickety Minsk III type of agreement that will be as much of a sham as the previous agreements. I don't think the Russians would go for that. I think they reached the point finally where they realized what liars are running the policy in Washington. That rather than fighting a positional war, they're looking for a way to finally destroy the Ukrainian army and really the Ukrainian state and dictate terms. I think that's what's likely to happen, but only about 10 guys in the Kremlin really know what the game plan is.
It's quite sad because when this war is finished, Ukraine will be a nation of widows and orphans. There will not be a generation of men to be fathers, husbands, to raise up the next generation of Ukrainian people. It simply will be a dying breed. To some extent, I saw that in Germany when I was stationed over there in the 80s. You could see it was hollowed out. The men had been killed in war. And you had all of these widows, and it's a sad thing to see. the uh, uh, the idea of this massive counteroffensive, already the Leopard tanks have developed considerable problems. These are the biggest block of the new tanks that they're getting. They're getting old stuff that was sitting in the boneyard for years and years, and now that they refurbish them a little, they send them and they break down. So I don't know how effective those will be. I'm sure that they'll have some impact. Some of the modern tanks are good, but the Russians have the T-90 tank, which is roughly the equivalent of the tanks we have. Probably the M1 tank is superior to the T-90. I think that's fairly clear. But the problem that Ukraine faces is people, and they're fighting these horrifically bloody battles. I have actually been on the ground where urban combat has been taking place in Syria. It's a very brutal and slow-going type of combat. But as bad as it is, it's not nearly as bad as what I call industrial urban combat, where you're fighting over area where there are great industrial plants, very easily defended, very hard to pry the defenders from. The Russians are now taking lots and lots of casualties, clearing out Bakhmut and some of these other places. But as the Ukrainians try to come back in, they're going to face the same problem. They're going to be faced with trying to wage industrial urban combat where they are the aggressors rather than the defenders. I think the prospects for Ukraine are not nearly what they were before, because if you think of it, at the very outset of the war, the Russians, when they crossed the border, they were vastly outnumbered by the Ukrainians. And the standard rule of thumb, in every army is that the attacker should have an advantage of 3-1. Well, when President Putin finally, after he had exhausted every means of trying to make peace, he knew that the Ukrainians were about to flood across the Donbass and take over the Russian-speaking area. And he decided to break up the momentum of that thing with an attack into Kiev. And but he made that attack with a home guard. This was not an expeditionary army like what the United States and Europe has that goes off and fights abroad all the time. This was a home guard. They didn't even have the legal authority to send many of their troops across the border. And so they went in with this very small force, and that gave the Ukrainians an initial advantage. They were much better armed than the Russians. They were much higher manpower, and then the Russians decided to get more serious. And now the Russians have had a modest but significant mobilization, and now their numbers are equivalent, probably superior to the numbers of the Ukrainians. So where did the Ukrainians come up with the 3-1? They can do it locally. You can always do it if you get local enough. If you have 10 guys and they attack some tiny spot where there are only 3 guys, you've got 3-1. But the war is a lot bigger than that, and I don't know where Ukraine comes up with the manpower to do this.
No, especially since the Ukrainian leadership has shown this really inhuman willingness to just send lots of guys into, I hate to use the term meat grinder, where, for example, in Bakhmut, people wonder why the Russians going so slow. Why haven't they closed off the cauldron? Well, as long as the Ukrainians keep sending soldiers in to be destroyed by Russian artillery, which has a rate of fire far greater than what the Ukrainians can muster because they just don't have the shells. If the Ukrainians want to keep sending men in there to be killed, then the Russians, I guess, will continue to oblige them. And you really do wonder, especially with this ridiculous actor as their so-called president, how the willingness of Ukrainians to keep going into that death trap. At some point you sort of wonder where guys start saying, my prospects of survival are a lot better if I shoot my officers than try to go shoot the enemy, because they're just going to die. And I think the Russians are aware of that. It's sad, but that's what's happening. And I don't know how this ends, Senator. My guess is at some point things finally crack. The Russians are using their air power now increasingly because the Ukrainian air defenses are depleted. They just don't have the air defense missiles anymore. And there are no replacements for them, just like there's no replacement for the artillery that they're expending, primarily 155 millimeter rounds. And there just isn't anything to replace. You talked about those tanks. Once those tanks are gone, they're only becoming available in small numbers. Once they're gone, they're gone. There are no more to replace them. What happens then?
Yeah, it seems to me, I spoke to the AfD party in the Bundestag back last June, and at that point, I mean, I'm not against Ukraine. I'm not against Russia. I'm really for peace and prosperity in Europe. And I said at that point, I said, here, Ukraine is they're in a pretty good spot on the battlefield, but ultimately they don't have the manpower, they don't have the industrial base. They're going to lose, and what they should do is they should enter into peace talks while they're in a good position, and they can guarantee that they're going to control Kiev, they're going to control Odessa, and they'll control even parts of the eastern part of Ukraine across the Dnieper River. Today, I don't know where it ends up, but I suspect that if they launch a major offensive and they are unable to make substantial headway, that the effort may simply collapse at that point, and then we may see a time where Russia takes off that portion of Ukraine which is to the east of the Dnieper River. And at that point, we know that the Polish are a very revanchist government. They have controlled a lot of territory, which is presently Ukraine. And oddly, Zelensky made this bizarre comment that there is no border between Poland and Ukraine. What leader would say something like that? I mean, it's insane. But I think that Poland has plans, contingency plans, that if Russia moves to the Dnieper River, Poland will move into Ukraine and they will take over a major part of Western Ukraine and incorporate it into Poland. And at that point, you're at best, you're going to have a rump state, which may involve Kiev, it may involve Odessa and some wheat lands, but it's going to be just a mere shadow of what it once was. So we'll see where it goes. Well, Jim, I think our time is about up. I appreciate you being here, and with you about to travel to the nation of Georgia, which is very involved in all of the geopolitics, and also to your ancestral homeland of Greece, which also is always at the forefront of the interface between the Christian world and the Muslim world with Turkey. It should be interesting. We look forward to talking with you and getting a briefing when you get back.
Thank you, Senator. I look forward to that as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank all of our listeners. This has been Focus on the News, and we will see you soon.